Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we are speaking with Corinne Boyer. Based in the particularly green Pacific Northwest, Corinne is a writer, teacher, and all-around expert in folk herbalism and traditional plant lore. She joins us today to talk about her latest book, Plants of the Devil. Before we begin, a bit of a heads up. The audio quality isn't great on my end. I had to move to get away from the sounds of the builders working on the guest house, but I probably should have just stayed where I was and put up with it. I've done my best to clean it up, but apologies for that. Corinne, however, is loud and clear, and who you are here to listen to anyway. So let's do that now. Corinne, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, traditional first question, of course, for first-time guests. Corinne, were you a weird kid?
Yeah, no surprise. Yeah, I definitely was. Yeah, just kind of tended towards one or two people and didn't ever really feel like I fit, Still don't. Nothing's really changed. Yeah.
Was the interest in the non-human world there from the beginning, do you think? I mean, are you a recovering suburbanite? Did you grow up in the woods,
Well, a little bit of everything, but my interest in the supernatural world has always been there. I had a big influence from fairy tales. My great uncle would tell us stories when I'd go to visit my grandmother's farm, and I didn't live in the suburbs, but we moved around quite a bit. I'm from Michigan, and often was very close to the woods or in the woods. So I feel like, but it wasn't like rural, I wasn't raised in a tiny town or anything, but I feel like I was exposed to nature enough, quite a bit, in order to form those, deep bonds early on without even knowing anything really, except for my own inclination. I always had a real curiosity about ghosts and haunted places and witches and, kind of the freaky, creepy. So that hasn't changed either.
Can you think of any of the fairy tales that your great uncle told you that stuck with you? Like, was there one where you go, wow, that is either, that's really fucked up, or that's amazing?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, my favorite two were Baba Yaga and Hansel and Gretel, for sure. And I really just, the witch figure who lived in the forest, who was part human, part supernatural creature, was always just really interesting to me. And, it's funny, I was never scared of her. I was always intrigued. So, and later I wondered in my adult years, I was like, why wasn't that freaky? It just, something about it was more intriguing than frightening,
Sure. Did you have any kind of supernatural encounters yourself as a kid? I mean, when was the first time that you realized, I guess experientially, that there is, something behind folklore, something behind these kind of stories?
Yeah. Yeah, there were different points where I would be alone in the forest. For a time from 4th grade until I was 18, so I guess from 10 to 18 or whatever, we lived in the woods, in a neighborhood, but in the woods, and there was a big back lot that was wooded, and I would spend quite a bit of time out there, sometimes with my brother, but oftentimes alone. And there would be times where I'd feel a presence, and didn't really know what to make of it. And same with my grandmother's farm. The upstairs, it was all built in the 1860s, and the upstairs was left virtually untouched, where the downstairs was remodeled into kind of two separate apartments for my great aunt and my grandma. But I would spend a lot of time piling through old things and antiques up there, looking through old diaries and pictures and just weird things. I love old things and always have, and definitely felt spirit presence there. But one thing I remember really clearly, there's two things, if I can share them.
Please.
In terms of distinct moments of kind of what you're talking about. One was I was probably 5th or 6th grade, and I was out in the back woods behind my house by myself, and it was like summertime or something, and there was this old stump, it was kind of rotting, and I was, hitting it with a stick, as kids do. So amusing. And part of the wood fell off, as I was hitting it. And inside the stump, there was a horseshoe. And it struck me so intensely, like, what is that doing in there? How the fuck did that get in there? A horseshoe, the horns are up. And I remember looking at it, and there was no part of me that wanted to take it out or touch it or keep it. It wasn't even like that. It was just amazing. There was something, and everything became crystal clear. It just felt really powerful to me, So I have no idea how that got inside of there. I mean, it was definitely embedded in the tree trunk.
Yeah, that is weird. That's a good one.
Yeah, it was pretty strange. And then my first time, I was always interested in the forest specifically, but in terms of learning the plants and, learning their names, and that took time. I didn't start really studying that stuff till I was about 19. But I was maybe 15, and I was visiting, a friend of the family. There was some family reunion that wasn't my family, this friend of the family, and it was getting close to twilight, and I just kind of went on a walk. I didn't know anybody, so I went on a walk down to explore the woods, and once again, it was summertime. The light was really incredible. Everything was just, glowing, and I came upon a patch of these purple flowers in the middle of a glade, and they were maybe 8 inches high. And I just got down on my knees, and they were absolutely glowing because they were pale lavender, and they smelled really strongly of like menthol and oregano. And I was just mesmerized by them. I had no idea what they were, of course, but I gathered a few of them, and their fragrance was so intense and comforting. And I saved them for years, and would occasionally open up my little Chinese medicine cabinet that I had been gifted as like a jewelry box, and I would smell them, crush them, and smell them. And later, when I was about 18, I found them again, and it was the Monarda fistulosa, the wild bergamot. So I figured out what it was. Now I grow them in the garden, but it was just a really amazing experience where I felt that plant really strongly, and I didn't have any tools to know how to interpret what I felt or anything, but it was definitely a spiritual experience for me. So.
And so you said you started learning the names and getting interested in it in a, I guess, professional capacity beginning around 19. Was there any stage where you wanted to be like an astronaut or a pilot or something, or was it sort of from the beginning that you were going to head in this direction?
Well, from a really young age, I wanted to be a singer. So that was my first, since I was 3, I thought I would be a singer and do vocal music. My father was a recording producer, and so I kind of grew up in a somewhat musical household. My uncle always played music, so I thought that just without question until I was about 15, and then it hit me, what that would actually entail, and I was like, oh, I don't think that's not going to work for me. Traveling all over, realizing how competitive it was, all this stuff. But I love to sing. I love folk songs and traditional ballads. But after that, I started getting, right around 15, I started getting interested in natural health. I worked at a alternative coffee shop in my little town, and they served really good food. I wasn't raised around alternative healing at all. I was raised around, conventional medicine. So I just got exposed to this world and felt really drawn to it. So it was from a pretty young age. And the plant part was interesting to me. I got my first herbal at around 16, but I had no idea, where to start. It was so overwhelming. I had no teacher. And really, if you know nothing, I mean, it's really hard to learn from books. You look at herbal and it's like, at 16, it didn't make any sense to me, but I knew that was the direction. So, yeah.
So how do you go from that one book? I mean, what were your steps? Did you like, I need to go and train with someone? Like, what were you, as you decided that this is going to be the direction, what did you do after that first herbal?
Yeah, so I put that thing down, didn't look at it again for years. But what I did was, I got, my early, I'd say 16 or so, I got into body care, like natural body care, essential oils, just kind of started with the basics, got, stopped wearing deodorant, stopped shaving, just said, I don't want any of these chemicals, and got into that kind of thing. And then when I was 18, I started with the wild foods, really. So I started learning local wild plants for foraging because I felt like that resonated. Just like springtime edibles, and basically learning from books. Thank goodness they were good books. I didn't really, and it's funny, I didn't realize that such a thing as an herbalist really existed. I didn't even know that because I was in such a like medical world. So my thought was to become a naturopathic doctor, and that's actually the path I pursued starting at the age of 17. 18, I had to start at community college because I was a high school dropout. I was a pretty troubled teen, but then got my head on straight, stopped being so self-destructive, and went for it. So I had to start at a community college, but then work my way up to getting a Bachelor of Science in Biomedical Science and Pre-Med with a plant focus, a heavy plant focus on ethnobotany and plant chemistry. So I kind of started... I started in a pretty academic environment, pretty scientific perspective, and then eventually ended up really missing the magic and the spiritual kind of connection that I felt since I was a child with the plants, and just didn't know. I just didn't know the avenues. So slowly over time, that became revealed to me. But I was super grateful for my academic background because it helped me to be able to do research later.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, in the latest book, you mentioned you sort of mentioned the slightly misspent youth. There's an anecdote, I believe, about Datura, which you didn't resonate with, but were you kind of encountering and experiencing, the entheogenic end of the plant spectrum at some stage?
You mean, was I taking them physically for their... like
mushrooms or any of that kind of stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, I dabbled in that a little bit. I did some mushrooms and acid, and but I'm really sensitive to substance, always have been. So I've never been able to tolerate pharmaceuticals or even painkillers, and so that was one thing. I was really cautious with substance, although alcohol was, was and still is my choice substance in some ways. Just it's just really predictable for me. I know exactly what to expect. But yeah, so I
hey, look, wine comes from grapes. You're preaching to the choir here.
That's right. That's right.
So you mentioned you were missing the kind of spiritual aspect. How did you stray either onto or back onto witchcraft and plant magic and so on?
Well, it's interesting. So the whole time I moved out from Michigan to Washington about 18 years ago to go to the Evergreen State College, and that's where I got my bachelor's. But the whole time I was pursuing this really intense academic, very scientific path, I was involved with some different women's groups. We were doing, pagan things, and I had dabbled in that in my teenage years too. Kind of, finding the Wicca. The readily available Wiccan stuff, and some of it resonated, but a lot of it didn't. And I kind of had my spiritual pursuits were kind of felt really separate from my academic pursuits, and eventually I stopped going to these women's groups, and I took it onto myself to start studying history, and got really into the witch trials and this and that. And I got extremely depressed, finding that information. I still hadn't found traditional witchcraft or folklore. I just hadn't found those genres yet. So I kind of set everything down in my mid-20s and ended up working with a community herbalist, Carol Trasado, really closely for about 4 years, and learning, more and more plant medicine, and then ended up working with another local healer, Joyce Nedishin, who teaches spirit of the plants and shamanic work with the plants. And that was really how I ended up managing to kind of bring my path that felt very separate and fragmented back together. Was through the trance work and the dream work and having the personal connections with the plants. You can have all the medicinal information in the world, and you can be able to make medicine with the plants and use it for your family and your friends. But if you're unable to kind of take the time to interpret and understand the magical and personal connection, then for me, something's missing. And so having that piece pushed me forward, and finally found folklore as like this whole field of study I just hadn't known. That was about 10 years ago. So I feel like I've spent the first 10 years with plants kind of specializing, getting to know their physical medicine, how to make medicine, how to use medicine, and then the second 10 years specializing more with the magical, more esoteric, spiritual aspects.
See, that was going to be my observation when you told me that story. It's quite sequential. So we all have our, for better or for worse, and for worse, I guess, Wicca phase in our teens. Yeah. But then if it smells right, you kind of level up, and it's interesting that you seem to have had a sequential experience with plant spirits that could probably only have happened the way it did, if that makes sense.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that's how the story came across as you were describing it. So, and it goes, well, it doesn't really go Wicca, scientific interaction, folklore, and then traditional witchcraft. I mean, once you kind of, because I remember a similar thing when you realize that folklore is alive and active and a viable route into these interactions. That can potentially open the door for things like traditional witchcraft, can't it? Because all of a sudden that stuff, it's already alive to you. So it's quite smooth is the wrong word. It's quite an intense but natural transition.
Oh, absolutely.
So for people listening, What is it? Like, when did you find it, and what is traditional witchcraft?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So, like I said, about 10 years ago, started studying, the more esoteric and having the personal work. There was a couple years in the beginning of that 10-year period where my teacher didn't allow any books, no books to be read about plants, like zero. So actually for about 3 years, I didn't read at all. I just had experience and dreams and worked with plants in my own ways, which was really powerful. So there was no other influence. And, because I'm not on the computer very much, I'm not reading blogs, and, I don't listen to podcasts. I just don't do a lot besides correspondence for what I have to do on the computer. So once I started getting back into reading and research and found the genre of folklore, it's almost like the plants led me to the magic. And then from there, it was like this whole world opened up, but I still didn't know that traditional witchcraft existed as like a branch or as an active part of modern practice. I had no idea till about, honestly, 5 years ago. I was just doing my own thing with folklore and plants and my own work with magic, and that was traditional, working with spirits and all these things. I had no idea that other people were doing it. It's kind of embarrassing, but it's really true. My head was just not in the world. And so I finally found out about it through, seeing it, because I wasn't on Facebook. I wasn't just on the internet at all, hardly, just besides emailing people. But yeah, I finally found it about 5 years ago, just through getting on the internet more for my business. I started teaching from my home 8 years ago, classes on plants with traditional folklore, and then have expanded those classes to include traditional magic and whatnot. Magical practice that's incorporating elements of the land and spirit power as well. But yeah, so in terms of, it was amazing to find people who were interested in the same things I was, even if they're far away, kind of,
Yeah, and it's a question of finding a label. Like, my next question on the list here is, do you think wildcrafting is... Can we define wildcrafting as separate, which we probably can, to traditional witchcraft? Because prior to you finding the term, right, it sounds like a lot of what you were exploring would fit under a wildcrafting definition.
Well, when I think of wildcrafting in terms of the way that, modern herbalists would use that term, it's gathering plants from the wild for medicine and or food use, generally speaking, or you could say material use as well if you're dyeing with plants or using it for fiber. So in terms of wildcrafting and traditional witchcraft, I see what you're asking, I think.
Yeah, I guess if we find a definition of wildcrafting that includes the interiority of the plants, so the actual plant spirits, then
Oh, right.
Do you know what I mean? Like, there's
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Right. Most people don't use it that way, but absolutely. I mean, the word, the term itself would be beautiful if it was taken that way, in the general herbal circles, which it isn't. But yeah, in some ways it's like, because traditional witchcraft is, like, in a lot of ways informed by the land and embodied by the land, which is of course going to include also more things than just plants. There's animals and the waters and the stones and all of the things on the land. So in that way, wildcrafting becomes a bigger, in that way it becomes a bigger term for materia magica and harnessing spirit power, for sure. I like that.
Yeah. So, latest book, which I adored, Plants of the Devil. You mentioned it's book 2 in a trilogy. And so this is kind of where I was leading with the wildcrafting versus traditional witchcraft question. Is there like an overarching thesis or concept that you intend to grapple with across 3 books?
Okay, so it's a little confusing because my first book, Under the Witching Tree with Troy Books, that's the trilogy. It's actually separate from Plants of the Devil.
Okay.
Yeah, so Plants of the Devil was like a second book that ended up happening kind of spontaneously between book 1 of Troy and book 2, which I'm working on currently, which is called Under the Bramble Arch, and that's going to be the wild plants. That should be done in the next couple months. But yeah, so Plants of the Devil isn't part of the trilogy. Gotcha,
but it emerges as a result. So, because that's interesting. I put out 3 books within a year and a bit a year ago, and it could I didn't expect them to hang together, and they did. And the final one, which is Pieces of 8, had to happen because of what I was saying in the other one. So Plants of the Devil isn't part of the trilogy, but it could only exist because of the trilogy, is a way of thinking about it, maybe?
Yeah, that's interesting to think about. Yeah, no, I mean, all things came together in the right way, that's for sure, for that to happen. And it was actually an idea that's been in my head for 5 years, the idea came out at the right time and the right moment, and it happened. So yeah, it's interesting though, getting back on track with my plant book with Troy. It's been a little challenging because it was a little bit of a derailment to get into the Plants of the Devil. It was written from a different place.
I see. Yeah.
So it's been like, in some ways I wish I would have finished the second book for Troy, in particular the first 2, which the first one was about the lore of trees. The second one is the wild plants. The third one is going to be a couple years off. That's going to be about garden plants. That one's going to be down the road. But the first 2 are really important, especially because a lot of those I've been working on for those plant write-ups I've been working on for over 8 years. So I have a lot of that material already. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But Plants of the Devil just came from this completely different place.
Look, when the devil knocks, you know.
better open the door.
Pretty much. Well, I really, really enjoyed the description of the devil as a multifaceted or multiphasic concept. I tried to get across some of that in Chaos Protocols and Pieces of 8, because it is a living container term for a whole bunch of stuff. And that really comes through. So I'm going to ask you, it's a bit challenging, what is the wild adversary? Like, let's attempt to put some borders, I guess, or structure around this concept.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the wild adversary, when I first started writing this book, which happened sequentially the whole way through, I started with the introduction, which was really hard. But anyway, that term came to me during that and the description of the book. And so what I feel that the wild adversary represents is basically the adversarial forces in nature that are not kind, that are dark, that are dangerous, that are wild, that are beyond human comfort. So it's like anything, really. I mean, and you could take that in a lot of directions, but that's what it represents to me. And I think I do say this at some point. I think in the introduction, or maybe in the last part of the book where I talk about in the alternative circles, there's a real tendency to whitewash nature, and to make everything benevolent and everything all beautiful and all healing. And it's just not true, So I feel like the wild adversary is the darker underbelly of nature and those powers. And the question is kind of how and why and in what way, do practitioners of magic work with those powers, and how has that happened in the past and still happening today? It's really fascinating to me.
Yeah, I love the term. It conjured, like, I'm about to say I'm going to steal it, but I won't steal it. I'll credit. What came to mind for me is, and this is why I sort of prefaced by talking about it as a container term, was all those places in the landscape I'd been to in the UK that have devil in the name. Because when you describe it as beyond human comfort, that's exactly it. So they're kind of like blasted moorlands, devil's teeth, devil's spine, devil's leg, all these kind of beyond human comfort places in the landscape. Which the book is, of course, about plants, but if we talk about the wild adversary, it's all that rolled into it.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so it's a great term that I think it's a really useful way of thinking with beyond human comfort is the word, isn't it? So it is. It's adversarial, and it's not there to be nice, and it's. Yeah, it's really difficult to talk about it without getting utilitarian, because
right.
it's just not there for you at all, right?
Sure.
It requires, there are things that can be gained from interaction with it, but I struggle to put that utilitarian, like, well, this is what you use it for. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. No, I think it's actually pretty impossible to do it any justice. And so that's the thing, the adversarial powers, it's the hardest teacher in terms of working with any kind of adversarial power, whether you're specifically talking about, the folk devil, or you're talking about working with adversarial plants or landscapes or terrain or haunted places that have those qualities. I mean, right? So the challenge of that is part of the intrigue, but like you said, there's nothing easy or comforting or familiar even. It's like pushing towards the working with the other, capital O, on the land, and that's what you're going to get. It's a wild adversary. A lot of times people. So this is interesting. So in my I have a couple programs. One of them's on my website. One isn't. But they're I call them the folk magic programs. So they're beyond just plants, and we don't even use plants for medicine or healing particularly. It's all magical use in those programs. But one of the things that, when we talk about land spirits, in a lot of circles, it's like there's this tendency towards worship and this land spirits are just so, amazing and healing and beautiful. And it's like, no fucking way. They are the most dangerous spirits beyond human dead. They're more dangerous than the human dead. They've been here much longer. Their power is much greater. So yeah, and those spirits, not always, depending on the place you're at, but they're very adversarial and oftentimes don't want anything to do with humans. So it's
preach. I think that's such a, I resonate quite a bit with what you're saying there. Especially trying to navigate the tendency to worship. I understand why, like, people come out of, a culture that thinks that the only approach to the more than human world is that kind of reverence. But
because there's such a gap of knowledge. Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. But born and raised Australian, oldest continent on Earth, oldest continually practicing cultures on Earth. And as a kid, I mean, I've written about this a bunch of times on the blog, but as a kid, doing my own, shall we say, Wiccan self-initiation in places in the landscape that I really should not have. If you want to know land spirits that give no fucks for your reverence or what have you, you'll find them here. Well, you find them anywhere, of course, but that isn't. You don't kind of put flowers in your hair and dance around. One, because there's lots of snakes here too, but also they don't. it's not the correct relationship. And this is what I love about the devil as a container term. Our cultural ancestors, in a way, were smarter. So the devil is a container term because that's the language they use. And crucially, it's the language they use within their belief system, which if we're talking about, Northwest Europe and Western Europe and so on, very Christian, mostly Catholic. And the devil in that cosmology, you don't worship. You can interact with it. Right. But it's very specifically put as this is potent and real, but you don't go to church for it. And I think people miss that with what something like the wild adversary can mean, or that meaning can unfold out of that term. And I think people miss that if they don't sufficiently get into the lore.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like basically taking it in another direction too, right? Where it's like worshiping the wild adversary or the devil. I mean, yeah, that's not what we're talking about. Like you said, it's not a place of worship; it's a place of interaction.
Yeah,
and that's in general with nature, and and the truth be told, you have to start somewhere. And if it comes from a place of worshiping and of course offerings are hugely important always, no matter what. I mean, worshiping can be, I'm thinking of that more as a mental state and an approach, not just in practice. But, you have to start somewhere. So if that's your way in, that's your way in, but ideally there's interaction, So sometimes too, I think people, it's like people throw around a lot of terms about spirits. So it's like, okay, spirits of the land, spirits of place, and it's a blanket term, And so what that, to me, the challenge and a big part of my interest in this work in general, beyond the plants, but began with the plants in some ways, is thinking about the interface between human and spirit power, the interface, the place where those two powers meet and there's an exchange. And so with land spirits, we're talking about specificity, we're talking about specific spirits. So that means, I live on 20 acres of forest that's never been lived on. And it's been logged once, clear cut probably 100 years ago and allowed to regrow naturally. And it's on a incline. So there's a bunch of stone. And it's pretty spooky in parts. And so it's like the specific land spirits of this place, I've seen in trance work, dream work, and I've actually, interestingly, confirmed that with some students without telling them anything. They had a very similar experience when we did trance work, because that's what I teach in my folk magic classes. And so, the land spirits here and the land spirits where you are and the land spirits, 20 minutes away can be different, and so it's like that's the thing where I like the challenge of getting more specific. It's just like when people talk about working with spirits in general and you call spirits in, it's like, who are you calling? Yeah. Let's get specific here, folks. Are you calling your ancestors? And if so, which ones? Not just my ancestors. Like all your ancestors don't want to work with you, I promise.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? So, same with plant spirit. Which ones?
It's, this isn't chat roulette. What are you doing?
Right. And it's good to think about that deeper. I think it's helpful. And there's an actual real give and take relationship that's just like, your relationship with your human people. It's similar in the sense of not the context, obviously, or the purpose, but in terms of it's an exchange. So,
well, see, that's where I retain. This is a weird way of describing it, I guess. That's where I sort of retain an optimism when I see people. Wrong is the wrong word. When I see people starting from that place of, and kudos for the interest, but starting from the place of probably less knowledge than is required, I kind of just go, well, eventually this will knock you on your ass. And when I think back to my disastrously rude, frankly, attempt at self-initiation using little Celtic god names I got from a paperback book on top of this waterfall near where I grew up in New South Wales, in a way it went really well. Because in a way I was initiated because this stuff works. I wasn't meant to be there and it wasn't happy with me. And so we quickly we got all kinds of, there was visual manifestation stuff as we're trying to walk back through the bush and along the beach to get back to civilization. And it was, in a way, an initiation, because I went there to kind of make sure that I knew that this stuff is real, and to announce myself to it in a strange sense. And that happened. It's just that I didn't skip back down to the beach going, "Yay, I'm a witch." Afterwards, it was more, right. oh, this is bigger than this little book I brought with me seems to have described.
Right. Well, and it's like like you said, you have to start somewhere, and ideally, wherever you begin, you just continue, so you get to learn, and that's the beauty. Wherever you are on your path and wherever you start, as long as you pursue and keep your, keep yourself in check, continuously reassessing your needs and your growth and where you're at and your blind spots and all the pitfalls along the way, that the knowledge will eventually build around you, But yeah, you got to start somewhere, even if it's dangerous, like you said.
Yeah, and I don't know if this happens to you, but I get asked, like, what book should I read or what book should I avoid? And I struggle with that question because those books led to that experience. However terrible they, history has subsequently shown them to be. We're all probably talking about the same books here. If I hadn't read that and gone out and done it, I really resist telling people what to read and what not to, because your sequence of catastrophic failures will be different to mine, but is part of the process. Go with it. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I really believe, and maybe you're in agreement with me, that the right books come at the right time. It's quite interesting. Quite interesting. That still happens, totally.
Well, yours falls into that for me. I'm not sure if you're aware, but you mentioned your 20 acres. We just moved on to, it's only 5 acres and it's some overgrazed farmland, but we just moved on to some farmland in southern Tasmania that we're about to commence the regenerative process on and have hedges and herbs and apple orchards and all that kind of stuff, right? So your book showed up. Yours is a very good example of that. I'm like, yes, this is exactly what I'm looking for.
Yeah, no, it totally happens. And just like, we could say this with all things. We meet the right people. We're supposed to meet at the right times. The right things come and open up at the right time.
They do. Yeah. So getting back to the devil and his various Jews, what sort of like landmarks and living systems fall under his auspices, both, ontologically and in reality, but also from folklore? Let's start with Devil's Acres, for instance.
Mm-hmm. So the Devil's Acre.
Yeah.
This being, you see it throughout different farming and agricultural lore, where a part of the field or an edge of a field, a strip of land would be left wild in like an offering to please the devil and or the local land spirits. And so in that way would assure good fortune for the land. It's like a pretty grand offering, really, when you think about it, when people were and still are toiling for their survival. So yeah, there's different examples of that in some of the British lore, and even some of the colonial American lore in the book. That's really interesting.
This is such a good example, I think, of what we were just talking about, the difference between worship and offerings. These were good Christian folk, and you give something to the devil. But more than that, from a permaculture perspective, you have an increase in biodiversity in those areas, and those interactions are required for pollination of your apple orchard or whatever it happens to be. And whilst they may not have been aware of, and I don't think we've got it right either, but whilst they may not have been aware of how essential that interactivity is, it's nevertheless interesting in that wild adversary sense that they've historically and culturally we have found a way to incorporate and describe and think with that understanding.
Oh yeah, that's a really good point. The biodiversity, and just like this, if it's part of a culture, it's just, like what we're saying, we're looking at it from a different perspective, like Christian folks giving this offering to a devil, and that could, or to the devil or to the local land spirits, the pagan spirits, whatever. And that could be interpreted as, oh, that's sinful from, but we weren't at the time and the place where that was happening. So it's just like part of the system, just like many of the, agricultural rights and different aspects of fertility, preservation. It's really awesome to find bits and pieces of that in some of the research, Yeah, and in terms of when you talk about his domain, you mean like specific plants you want me to talk about?
But I think, let's talk about, I like the old fruit trees one, for instance, or ones, like that's the kind of, so talk us through that.
Yeah, so it's some of the old trees, in particular ones that were barren or not productive anymore, were thought to be haunted by devils or demons. And so what I write about in that first chapter there is thinking about, okay, so anything that kind of stopped producing and wasn't useful for the day-to-day survival was demonized. And also the natural disasters, the blighting of crops, blamed on the devil. So it was part of their worldview also. It wasn't glorified and romanticized. It was just part of the worldview.
There is something about them. This valley I'm in is a apple growing region. It was a huge apple growing region with exports to Britain up until Britain joined the European Economic Community in the 70s. So they started getting their apples from Europe instead. And eventually the Australian government paid the farmers in the area to rip up these 100-year-old orchards and put in sheep or what have you, because there was no one to buy the apples, which just is crazy now that they're desperately trying to plant them again for the cider boom. But there are nevertheless in kind of corners of different fields or old properties and so on, apple trees that are 130 years old, like lone apple trees, or one or two in an overgrown abandoned orchard, and they are creepy. For real. You get like in a good way off them, and I really enjoyed that. The sort of old fruit tree association. You again understand the living language and symbols they're using to incorporate that kind of stuff. Right. And often those old apple trees have a hole in them, and a hole in the tree is like spirit portal. So it's spirit could reside in there. Spirits, not even the spirit of the tree, but other spirits, land spirits or whatever. So it's really interesting. We have some of those out here too. 100-year-old apple trees here and there, like what you're saying. That you never find. Usually, you don't find a bunch in one spot, but they're here and there on old farmland, and they're really incredible. I also, on a related matter, I loved your discussion of the willow. They're considered an invasive. I mean, technically they are, but I have problems with that term in Australia because they're so thirsty, and this continent doesn't get that much water. Tasmania does, so it's less of an issue. But we have these two really big ones on either side of the road heading into the town, my closest town. And I really enjoyed your discussion, particularly of how they feel at night. There's this sort of very eerie places when you go underneath them. So let's have some willow lore then, shall we? Yeah. So willow, and it's interesting too. I mentioned this in the book. Also, alder, Alnus rubra, and then the cottonwood tree. At least out here. So that's the populus, the black cottonwood, Balsam niferat. So those water-loving trees, they all have dark lore associated with them. And one of the things that after reading about them and doing the tree research for the other book, I think part of that is because watery places are often places where humans can't inhabit. They can't build there. They can't. They're like off limits. Swamps and whatnot. You can't live there. So they're like, oh, that's where all the creepy spirits go. And it makes sense to me. And so some of the old stories tell that. But willow in particular she's one of my favorite trees, and I've worked with, besides medicinally, of course, but tree a lot in instances of grief. I've lost some really close family members over the years, and it's been extremely hard. So, and willow's folklore is connected to grief and also forsaken love, and quite a bit of cursing lore, which is in the book. I give examples not only of some of the devil lore with the willow, which my favorite one was one way to become a witch is go sit on the roots of a willow tree and renounce your baptism, and then you sign a book that the devil brings in your own blood. But some of the lore, some of that cursing lore I like to share too, because it also reflects the darker character of the plants. The willow trees around here, we have 4 different species, but of course they're hard to tell apart.
but there's some really gnarly ones down the road on the creek that are just, they're unbelievably beautiful and old. Parts of them have fallen, and then the new golden growth sprouts from these old hollow trunks and branches, and they're just, they're really, like, there's a comfort about them, but yet there is a danger. You can feel that with that plant. But I do highly recommend for any sort of grieving, go hang out with old willow trees. It will help.
Some of the curse recommendations that are in there, because I did went in January, because we're quite far south, we get sunlight quite late, so I went and stood under it in a really late, it would have been about 10 p.m. and there's still light out, and it was a really eerie and good experience. And there's all the recommendations for curse work that you have in there. I'm like, I don't wish I had someone to curse, but I'm like, there's all this cool stuff I could do.
Now you got some ideas.
Exactly.
It'll happen eventually. Well, one of my favorite pieces of willow lore too is the 99 leaves. You gather one leaf from 99 different willow trees, and you take all those leaves. You'd probably do it over a year or two, maybe a season, and then you dry them into a powder and use it for clairvoyance and divination. I love that.
All right, that one. When I do my first Tasmanian road trip, I'll see what I can do. Wander around and keep collecting, keep count. I don't think it would take that long, actually, if you're in a swampy area, but pretty cool. So some of the plants of the devil I did not expect to fall under his auspices. So parsley, for instance. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, there's some surprising ones in there. So the whole thing about the slow seed germination, once again, something out of the ordinary being demonized. So generally speaking, parsley takes about 4 weeks to germinate. It needs a cold period, but for people that were planting annual crops, it's a biennial. So the first year, it's going to make its leaf foliage, and the second year it makes its seed. So if you want a continual supply, you're going to plant it every year, because when it makes its seed head, you're not getting much foliage. You get some. It depends on how your season is. But so I think that for folks that were planting annual vegetable seeds, and they sprout in 7 to 10 days or whatever it is, these parsley seeds not sprouting, that was one thing out of the ordinary. So there's all this lore about, the seed has to go down to the devil and back up 13 times, or, all sorts of funny ways to explain their slow germination process. And then the other thing is that parsley was used as an abortifacient. And that's another reason why I think that it could have been demonized, because, of course, herbal abortion and quite taboo still is. So I wonder if that's part of it. And then we see it as an ingredient in some of the flying ointment recipes, right? So it's interesting. It's like this like, the herb you get as a garnish on your plate when you go to some restaurant, that we have in our kitchens that people grow in their culinary gardens. It's like this ill-omened lore. It's really cool.
Yeah.
And another example of that I love to share briefly, and it's similar. It's not devil lore, but it's some ill-omened lore thyme. So Thymus Vulgaris, our common culinary thyme, has a bunch of creepy lore associated with it. And something that happened with a student of mine years ago, one of the things I recommend is, pick a plant, go sit with it. Don't know anything about it. Doesn't matter if you know any of the lore. It's better not to know ahead of time, just to go and have an experience. And then let's talk about the lore afterwards. So she decided to sit with the thyme plant, which was one of her favorites, whatever, in the garden. And she's like always had these great experiences. So she came back and said, of the class at the time, she said, it's really weird. I had a super creepy experience. And I said, really? She said, yeah, I had this vision of my hometown, somewhere out east. And she said there was this building that was haunted by this little girl who we thought had been murdered. And you'd see her face in the window up at the top of the building. And it was super creepy. And I can't believe that's what came up with this plant. And I said, well, you're not going to believe this. And I got out the lore and read it to her. And the thyme plant is associated with the ghosts of murder victims.
That's cool. Very nice.
Isn't that crazy? Yeah. So something so innocent that we've been, culturalized to just believe is just like, oh yeah, put it in your spaghetti. Of course, there's much more to it than that. And that's what's so beautiful about the lore of the past. People, there were so many different ways to use the plants that are so beyond just, a tincture or a salve or put it in your spaghetti. And so there were so many different connections. And those things, those kind of experiences, which happen regularly with my classes, that's why I love to teach, they're very confirming to people picking up on those threads. They're right under the surface for all of us.
So how would we, because that appeals to me for a number of grimoiric reasons, how would we unpack that capacity of time? So could you burn it in an effort to call up the ghost of a murder victim?
Yeah, well, burn it or smell it, just the fragrance alone, in particular, the flowers. So yes, and another thing I think about, maybe using it also because of just something that comes intuitively is that a lot of the aromatic plants were protective plants from the spirits of the dead or ill, evil spirits. So I wonder if it could be used to cleanse a place too after the spirit, after something like that happened in a place. So
I agree completely that the interiority of the plants through history is so much more than the tinctures. Like the thing that I laughed out loud about with parsley was that Cotswolds believed that it always grew better when it was planted by a bad man, because mine went nuts last year. Like we were like, why is the parsley going so good? And I'm like, what a sick burn.
Yeah, that's the lore. Only witches can grow parsley.
There you go. Mine went full Jumanji up there. So
nice. I know mine's going crazy in the little mandrake greenhouse. I'm like, yes, this is perfect companion to mandrake.
Well, so that was going to be one of the last questions, but we've led into it. When I get herbalists and people with your kind of plant wisdom on the show, I ask them for suggestions for what people can do in smaller spaces. So off the top of your head, like, what are some suggestions for a devil's apartment balcony garden? Like, let's try and go with a small possible space.
Okay, so parsley. Parsley plants, in terms of ease of growing and that do well in pots. Is that what you're wondering?
Yeah, that kind of thing. I mean, I try to make the recommendations as inclusive as possible. So obviously there'll be people out there who have backyards and
sure,
what have you, but let's stick with an apartment balcony.
Yeah, okay, so you could definitely, I've seen datura grown really well in pots. Mandrake in pots, absolutely. You got to have deep pots. You can basically make your own with plastic pipe, but you could do mandrake and datura, parsley. You could do, trying to think about rose. I don't think so. It's such a hedgy plant. I mean, you could grow some, some of the roses, as long as they had thorns, they would qualify in my book, as long as they're not the thornless. So some of the thorny, but maybe the more cultivated varieties, so they're not hedgy, because that wouldn't.
So really anything that you could grow up the actual balustrade, it would have thorns. So you kind of mentioned wild roses or roses. Ivy, if you're in the right climate, is another one maybe? Yeah. Yes. I mean, ivy will do fine anywhere. Obviously trees probably. Well, curly willow you could probably grow in a pot, actually. Some of I think you could do henbane in a pot. Although doesn't have a ton of devil lore, but in terms of poison gardens. And then I'm trying to think. Nettles wouldn't do very well. It's kind of surprising. Nettles transplant really easy, so I wonder if you could grow a little patch of nettles. I think if you had rich enough soil, honestly, and if you watered it enough, you could grow nettles in a pot. Yeah, probably. It's you've had the most difficult task of the people, the sort of herb types that I've had on, because kind of the point of these things is their exteriority from the human world, and if you're talking about an apartment garden, you're really after that's very human world, right? But there's some very true. There's some really good suggestions there. Now, why might we do that? Is there more to it? Can we consider this an offering? Is it a teaching space so that you can kind of sit with it?
Yeah, for sure. So, especially for folks that live in the city that don't have access to, usually there's some really nice parks and some wild places that can be found, obviously. That's ideal to go spend time in those wild places, even if it's like an abandoned lot with a little swamp on it. When I grew up in neighborhoods around Michigan, even though we were close to the woods, there were different abandoned lots I used to play at, and those were magical places. But yeah, in terms of having the garden, it's definitely to spend time with the plant through the seasons, and even if it's not in its wild habitat. So or in a garden setting where it kind of has room to do its thing, it's more confined, and it's going to take more attention, actually, more care in some ways, because there's not, a bunch of soil to hold the water and whatnot, and other things, other considerations with that. But I think that it's definitely worth doing. So then you can actually, watch the plant throughout the seasons and spend time around the plant and learn from the sensory ways. And that's how our brain works when learning plants. I always tell my students, we are all made to learn plants. It's part of our survival. We have to know in deeper parts of our brain how to learn the plant. So it can be overwhelming and whatnot, but believe that you have the ability. And I've watched people that have known nothing about plants go through a season and learn so much from sensory information. So seeing, touching, smelling, not necessarily tasting, but just in observing the plants through the seasons, I think is really worthy task. Yeah.
I like that you say not necessarily tasting, because I think my favorite chapter title in the book is Hell Broth and Wild Tables. So the chapter on poisons is also, and this is, I guess, kind of what you were just saying there. There's a spectrum relationship, if you will, with the plant worlds, where you will wild harvest leaves and food for the table, and in that chapter there's also and also these things will kill you, and I really like that. I don't want to call it a dichotomy. It's not. I really like that kind of spectrum idea. And right. Are there kind of, you mentioned as a suggestion for people learning to just do the sensory information thing for a year.
Well, that's with a teacher. Let me clarify,
sure.
Gordon.
Okay, right.
A teacher. Or without touching or tasting, whatever.
Yeah, don't just go sampling in the woods. No.
Right.
But okay, so for people who are not with a teacher, what are some of the best ways to come to know the wild plants in the area? Like, what are the first steps? Is this why you put the two of them together, which is step one is learn your poisons?
Yes. Yeah, that's why I talk about that, is any place you live, whatever environment you're in, I feel like learning the poison plants first is really helpful, because there's not very many of them, honestly, not that will kill you dead. There's usually not very many. There's plenty more, quote, useful and or medicinal plants and or just plants that are neutral that will maybe make you a little sick. But in terms of plants that are seriously poisonous, there's not usually a ton in terms of this different species. That doesn't mean, there are parts where poison hemlock, Conium maculatum, grows like crazy, so it's all over. I'm not saying that it's not going to be prominent. I'm just saying in terms of actual species and different specific plants, there's not usually too many. So yeah, when you're learning your plants, it's helpful to go to one. It is helpful to spend time in one place throughout a seasonal year, watch the plants throughout the seasons, learn the poison plants of the area. I've spent a lot of time, I did learn without a teacher for a number of years, and then did get a teacher eventually. And that's the best way to learn is from a person, obviously, but lacking that, nowadays, there's some incredible work being done, in particular with wild foods. Once again, a nice place to start. I highly recommend any of Samuel Thayer's books. He's really revolutionized wild foods literature because of his standard of quality. Anyway, I could go on and on about his books. He has 3 books now, and he does take the time to. He has really high quality photographs, and some of those plants compare with some of the poisonous plants very specifically. So that's helpful too. But starting with food is just a nice idea. But if you're not comfortable with that, even going on herb walk, taking the time to go to 2 hours away to go on one herb walk can be amazingly helpful, even if it's a 3-hour herb walk, So just getting to see the plants from somebody who knows them. I'll never forget this. I went into the woods. This is when I was, I was early 20s, and I went into the forest, and my first goal when I moved to the Pacific Northwest when I was 21 was to learn the plants of this place. So I did an ethnobotany contract, and I just immersed myself fully in this new place and learned the plants. That's all I did for whatever months, and it took 10 years to do it. But really, but I took a friend out in the woods and was showing her different plants after a couple years of learning the plants, and she said, "How do you know the difference? Honestly, they all look like just the same to me." And I said, and I thought about it, and I said, well, it's like learning another language. Brain will start to discern the differences, the nuances, in the details, right? So eventually you'll be able to tell the differences in the shades of green and the textures and, the presentation and like the shape of the leaf and all these things that you wouldn't see maybe if your eye isn't trained yet, but we all learn that way. So anyway, keep going. Yeah, my suggestion is go to the same place over and over, that has a wide diversity, and do walks there and try to get really high quality field guides, and always like quadruple check. That's what I did. If you think you have a plant, you think, oh, this is poison hemlock. So you have 4 field guides. You look at it in those, or weed guides. There's some really good weed books, actually. They're really helpful. And then you Google the Latin name and look at the images. So Conium maculatum, and 98% of the images that come up will be the right plant. 2% won't. But still, you'll see a variety of shots and angles that you'll never get to see in 4 field guides. So that's always interesting too.
Yeah, very cool. All right, so we've given people suggestions for a Devil's Apartment balcony garden, and also some kind of next steps on learning that local interactivity in local plant space situation. I once again, congratulations on the book. I found it fascinating, and also, as I said, mildly hilarious in parts where I was told I was a bad man because of my amazing parsley skills. But for people who want to know more about yourself and about the book and all that kind of stuff, what do they do and where do they go?
Well, I have a website. It's Maple Mist Wood. You can just Google Maple Mist Wood. That's the name of the place here. And there's a list of 2 of the programs I teach and the couple of books. And there's, for 5 years now, I've put out a free quarterly herbal newsletter. I haven't done it actually in the last 6 months. I'm kind of fading away from doing it. But for 5 years, I kept up with that. So those are all online. I think there's 21 of them, and they're all on there and can be printed. So there's a lot of recipes. There's lore. There's some of my personal prose and poetry. There's all sorts of things. And there's folklore about other things besides plants in those too. So especially so you can check those out. I think that's a good resource if you like the kind of the connection with the lore, but also the hands-on and practical use, which I'm really a big proponent of. I don't want to just read the lore. I want to do these things and live them. So there's that. The herbal newsletters are great for that. And then I am on Facebook. I just kind of keep a professional profile so people can friend me on there. And then I usually try to update, if I have an article in something or I'm doing a conference or whatever. I just keep that pretty much for use. And I correspond with folks on there too. So yeah, I think those are probably the best ways. And on the website, there's an email form so folks can email if they have questions about classes or if they're in the area or whatever. So
nice one. Well, all of this will be in the show notes, of course. But Corinne, this has been a great chat. I always love talking about this kind of stuff, and I think you've really nailed something important that's going to stay with me about that wild adversary notion. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Gordon. Thanks for having me.
Some really good stuff there. The dangers of parsley, for one, but also a bunch of really useful insights into thinking with the more than human world. Corinne's notion of the wild adversary adds some worthwhile nuance to the devil as container term. And the book itself is filled with the sort of historical insights into precisely how that played out in different parts of the world. Most of you are heading into spring, which means there is no time like the present if you fancy having a crack at the sort of interactions Corinne describes. Details, of course, in the show notes. So, That's the episode for this week. Please do subscribe on YouTube or in your favorite podcatcher. Share the show around. Share your thoughts at runesoup.com or the Runesoup Facebook page. And as ever, find me on Twitter where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.